Hey there, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks for asking. Can you hear me all right then? I
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
okay, that is great. I can hear you just fine. And you said you are free from noon to 12:30, right?
No, I'm free till like 1. So yeah, I have plenty of time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for hopping on with me. I really do appreciate that.
Yeah,
And
of course.
I'm not sure, did I tell you much about the book I'm writing?
You just said it was about education equity.
Yes. So the idea behind the book, the working title right now is The College Admissions of Guilt. And it's basically about how there might be some unfair systems in place, or there might be some problems within admissions that need to be addressed, and especially how can underrepresented students, such as first gen students of color, underrepresented, lower socioeconomic status, how can they better succeed at academia? I'd love to just change the system entirely, of course, but that's not reasonable. So I figure let's write a book about how I'm also first gen, by the way. How can students who are underrepresented better present themselves at campus? What kind of skills can they learn to better succeed while in higher ed?
Yeah, that's awesome.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So that's basically the idea behind the book here. So I just want to jump then right into the first question here about your foster to prison pipeline work. As I said before, I'm a transracial adoptee. So I'm going to ask, what does this foster to prison pipeline mean for those that don't know? And how does your social justice work act to change it?
Yeah, so essentially, I'm sure as you probably know just from doing the work you do and also the, social justice kind of lens or critical lens, um, we talk about like the school to prison pipeline and a lot of other pretty much anything to anything pipeline when it comes to young black men in particular, but any pretty much black and brown kids being obviously over policed. It's just every part of the system, as we know, being over policed, being overcharged, being sentenced, every part of it. And we see that in the foster system as well. And there's some stats that within like 5 years of exiting care, about 26% of youth are incarcerated. And there's like a ton of just egregious statistics that have come through in terms of the disproportionate rate of youth crossing over from the foster system or pretty much any branch of the child welfare system. I guess, as you probably know from being an adoptee, it's like, the child welfare system is kind of like the big umbrella, and then there's like a bunch of different parts within it. And so I think we're seeing just like a ton, large numbers of youth, predominantly young Black men, crossing over from the child welfare to the juvenile justice system. And I think, again, like there's so many pathways that happens. It's even something I've been thinking a lot about recently is like surveillance within schools and like cameras and facial recognition technology. And for foster youth, a lot of times faces are already in the system and then they're being over policed and over like recognized by these facial recognition technologies within schools. And that's kind of compounding the over policing. Um, and then we see in other countries who have different approaches to justice, criminal justice, youth justice, child welfare, depending kind of on their welfare states and organized social policies, the crossover rates are pretty dramatically different.
Definitely. And I'm paying attention here. I'm also writing notes down as I speak
Oh
just to make
yeah, for
sure
sure.
I get all this down in one go. So thank you for that. So you based on this work that you've done within the foster to prison pipeline, obviously that means a lot to you. And you were a foster student, I believe, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Would you mind talking a bit about that if you're comfortable?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I was in kind of different facets of the child welfare system pretty much my whole life growing up. And then went back into foster care in high school. And I think just being an older foster youth at that time, that's when you see a lot of youth that you're in care with, or just like people that you encounter in the system really being swept into incarceration or homelessness or survival sex or other survival crimes. There's just like a ton of outcomes for foster youth, and I think like older foster youth, because you're so vulnerable in terms of a lack of support. And when you're aging out, there's just so little support as well. And I was really lucky. I think something I like always talk about, whenever I'm talking about this stuff is obviously I'm white, I'm a white woman. I didn't experience like any of the kind of over policing or any of those things that all of my friends in the system who are overwhelmingly Black and brown, and also, low income, coming from like very, just like every kind of marginalized identity that you could possibly imagine, layers on layers. And I also went to a smaller private school on scholarship in high school. And I think that for me too just gave me like a tremendous leg up in the education sphere. And although like socially I was pretty miserable and hated it, I think like educationally it definitely gave me like a pretty solid education, especially in St. Louis, where I grew up. For the most part, a lot of the schools are not accredited in the city, and also moving around so much. That's one of the tremendous challenges of foster youth, is that every time you move, then you're also moving schools. And for me, I wasn't moving schools. And so I think that was like also one of the huge advantages that I had, is I didn't have to start over every time I moved. And especially junior and senior year of high school, I moved so many times. There just was like no way that I would have graduated high school. So yes, that's I guess a little bit about sort of my educational journey / experience and care.
Well, thank you for opening up. I do appreciate that.
Of course.
You mentioned scholarships a bit in that answer you gave there. Would you say that scholarships are a big reason or a big way that you can almost level the playing field in that regard?
I think so, yeah. And I know our school had like I honestly don't know the numbers. It's not very transparent in terms of the numbers that they, in terms of scholarships or full scholarships and whatnot they give up, or they give out. But I do think it's a way. I just think also then when youth like get to those schools, you have to support them, because if they're coming from like different educational backgrounds in contrast to people who've been in really high, like quote unquote quality education or like private, whatever the case is. And then you have youth coming from different parts of the city that are incredibly underfunded schools, like don't even have enough pencils to give their students, or just are unaccredited. And like if they graduated from there, they literally wouldn't even count as having a diploma. So I think it's, helpful to give scholarships, but then there also needs to be support when people get there. Otherwise, you're kind of good luck, and then you're leaving them to be there with no support.
So support more than a scholarship, in that opinion, more than just tossing money at them. They need that, what do you call it, systemic support, or just systems that are in place at the schools that actually offer aid and mentorship and guidance more than just here's some money to get them on their way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that is definitely helpful. And just one more thing on the scholarships then, for those that are trying to find that money to get them to the next step, as someone who's now gone through that several times, what are some advice you'd give to get those scholarship opportunities?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think back to like my college application. Um, I think it's a balance of, sharing whatever you feel comfortable with, because I think depending on the background we all come from, and different like marginalized identities that we all hold, there's sometimes a lot of pressure to like share your story and like, everything that you've overcome. And, kind of the expression I think that comes up is like poverty porn, and wanting to like continually being pressured by your school when you get to a higher education institution, or even in high school, to share your story and, thank donors and whatever the case is. And I think like I definitely felt a lot of that pressure when I was in high school. And I remember like my guidance counselor like really pressured me to share like a lot about my story. And actually a few weeks ago, I was like looking back at I honestly, I didn't even have most of my admission materials, but I found my personal statement and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't, like, I shared all of that because I definitely was not comfortable doing that, but I just felt so much pressure of like, share this, share that. Um, and I wish that I hadn't done that, but you're like 17. And so you're like, okay, like, this is the advice I'm getting. I guess I'll do it. But then it was interesting to look back at like then my graduate school application and my Rhodes application and see how much that had transformed, where it's like not at all about me. It's about like the work that I'm passionate about doing and the communities that I want to uplift their voices and their experiences. But sorry, I kind of deferred from your advice, but I guess the advice I would give is just, especially in undergraduate, is just sharing what you're comfortable with, because ultimately like you're going to get to these places. Obviously there's like a million systemic factors to facilitate, but it's not just because of your story and like what you've overcome. It's also you and like all of the work that you've done. And I think just remembering that you have agency and autonomy over how you tell your story and what you share, and no one else gets to coerce you into doing that. Even when you feel pressure, it's just remembering that you do have autonomy and agency over your story. And that's just period. End of sentence.
End of sentence. Got it. Thank you. No, that did answer the question. I love that answer there. You say it's more of a switch from the primarily subjective to more an objective point of view, from more or less of an emotional appeal to an almost competency based statement that emphasizes the work that you've done. Agency and autonomy is the quote that I have down from you. End of sentence. You have that choice. Share what you're comfortable with and really emphasize what you do and what you want to do in the future. Would that be
Yeah.
a good summary of what you said?
Yeah. And I think just, yeah, I think the biggest thing is just like you have autonomy over your story. And I think it's great to talk about, how that those experiences have informed your work and what you want to do, and like your motivations kind of moving forward. Because that's really like that's mostly still what my undergrad application focused on, but that's really like, I'll have like a line from my background, just because that was also, I was like, I don't actually owe anyone my story. Like I can tell it when I want and how I want. And also that's, of course, a part of who I am and informed all of the work I want to do. And that's not all of me. I'm a multidimensional person with a lot of things, a lot of identities, a lot of beliefs. And I think remembering that about yourself is like, of course, that's a part of where you came from. And you can decide to hold that however you want and carry that with you in whatever ways feel empowering and good to you. But no one else, like you don't owe anyone your story, and you get to decide that.
That is a quote right there. You don't owe anybody your story. All right. I'm definitely putting that one in there. I like it. I like it a lot. So you've come from all of this, and now there's, well, the big news story that I kind of discovered you on with the Rhodes Scholarship, University of Penn, the Ivy League. For one, would it be fair to say that you're a first gen student?
Yeah, so I think it's always like a complicated, when you're coming from the foster system and then you age out of care and then you're like, okay, I'm the only, like, then you kind of become the only generation. And so I think that's like a hard thing for then people to explain, like to understand it in some ways. But I definitely consider myself a first generation student, because when you age out of care, then you are like legally considered like you have no parents. The state where you're your parent, and then you age out, you're dropped out of care at 18 and you have no one to support you. So it doesn't really matter if you're living with foster parents who have degrees, or other, I had kind of a blend of foster families who's, I guess one of them had degrees, who I was living with when I applied to college. But yeah, I think it's really just, it's a for sure complicated answer. But again, I think something else that you kind of have control over in terms of like, I'm sorry, it's hard for, not you personally, but like XYZ to understand. But that is like my experience, in terms of how I navigated the world.
Of course, it's not as simple as just checking a box off. Some things require what do you call it, a short answer, if you will, more than just fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. So as someone who has now made it to the Ivy League, right, your University of Penn, what is your advice for others who might be from, what is called about the underprivileged groups of whatever race or ethnicity or low socioeconomic status? What is your advice for them to succeed in higher ed?
Yeah. I think that's also such a challenging question because, again, there's so many things that I can't speak to because of my positionality as a white woman, as a cis woman, and there are facets of marginalization attest to in terms of being, low income and queer and other kind of things. But for the most part, I think there's a lot of things I just like can't really give advice on because I haven't had those experiences. I will share in my experience what I found to be kind of like a survival tool was finding my community when I got to college because the semester was so hard. I was so sad and anxious and depressed because I moved and I had, like a fairly solid support system in high school. And then I had no support at all when I got to Penn. And really like and all of these teachers that were really important to me there just kind of fell off for one reason or another. And so I got there and I was like, oh my God, I like don't know anyone. I feel horrible. Like I can't do this. I literally was like, I'm going to drop out. And I just felt like I had no support. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to fail. I'm going to flunk out. And like, I can't do this socially. So I just should drop out. And I was like convinced, like through my first semester, I was like, I'm going to drop out. And luckily, I found kind of like a community of people at Civic House, who was this kind of one of the first communities that I kind of entered, who really rallied me and just like was such a strong community that we all just like really, I think, felt like family and really like stepped up and showed up for one another. And just the relationships and chosen family that I was able to find in college, like those are, I think, was like my saving grace, truly. I don't think I would have finished college, let alone like gone to graduate school and applied for this fellowship. Like there's just literally no way. Because I just was so upset and like, you're on your own. You're not like ready to be 18 and then be like, all right, good luck. Like, so I think to the best that you can, finding people that will show up for you and that like make you feel good and will support you in any ways that you need and that feels meaningful to you.
Definitely, definitely. So, a chosen family is a huge aspect of success at college. Finding your community, finding that network, whether it be mentors like a professor, academic, or a friend, someone just to lean on to kind of have that built trust over time. Is that a big aspect of succeeding at college is fitting in and having your people at college?
1,000%. Yes. And I think for me, again, there's so many things I can't speak to. One thing I did experience a lot is I'm queer, and in high school, there was just a pretty significant amount of homophobia, and there was like really hardly anyone who was out. And one of my good friends who was out, she just like got so much shit. It was a lot of microaggressions, and I just was like, nope, like I'm just suppressing all of this. And then I got to Penn and I was like, holy shit, like there's this whole community of people who are just like so out and like proud and like just genuinely like feel great being themselves. And I think that really emboldened me and gave me an environment that I was able to really come into my own and explore that identity and just like come to this place where I'm so like happy and whole in terms of being able to express that. So that was really special. And I think that is, I guess, some advice I would find is like, depending on the identities you have, finding other people who share those and can validate those experiences. And sometimes like one group of people share one identity and another share another identity. And you'll have other ones that share all these identities with you. And I think that was really meaningful to me, is like finding people who did have similar experiences and could validate sort of the experiences that I had and vice versa.
Mackenzie, that is awesome that you kind of found your community at University of Penn, and that University of Penn has that, so that people have their people, their community. It means a lot. Fitting in, having your built trust group, community, if you will. Keep saying that word, chosen family. Obviously, it's a big part of academic success. You got this Rhodes Scholarship, and you're obviously very intelligent and academically strong. And we're kind of hinting around about that, but you definitely seem to hit more about your story and your people and how that really is a big driver for you. And that's why you do what you do with your work in foster care systems. So I'm thinking of putting you, if you want, in this section of my book that's under a discipline. There's like 6 disciplines that I have, and one of them is it's not the brand name, but the brand behind your name that matters.
Mm.
What is your reaction to that quote?
Yeah, so I guess just to make sure I understand, so kind of like the idea that it's not necessarily like Penn, but it's Penn being behind my name, like as the school that I got my degree from.
What we're thinking about the quote is kind of it's less about the brand name of what you wear or where you go to, but what you do while you're there that matters. Would you agree with this statement?
Yeah, I think a reality is like once you graduate from a school that has like some sort of influence or whatever the case is, like people are going to look at you differently. You're going to have access to spaces that you wouldn't necessarily have access to. And I mean, that was in complete honesty, like part of the reason I chose Penn as opposed to like a state school. And part of the reason is like aid, but also like I was like, okay, I don't have access to a lot of the connections that other kids do through their parents or like other kind of communities. And so I was like, I need to figure out how to do that. And that was kind of like, I guess, a way to access those spaces. Um, and at the same time, I think it is like what you spend your time doing and the things and the people that you surround yourself with. And I think I had a very unique experience at Penn because I kind of Civic House, I think, really fosters a sense of like continuing to have it, like continuing to examine your positionality relevant to your identities in the world and how that those combinations of like privilege and marginalization, depending on your identities, um, impact how you walk through the world and how communities interact with you and see you. And I think that being surrounded by those critical people who are always like, we were always examining that and like taking a step back was really integral to the experience I had and just in terms of coming to a deeper understanding of how my identities impacted everything that I was able to experience in the spaces that I already had access to because of my whiteness and because of a few other, going to a private school in high school. And I think also then that changed like the extracurriculars I was involved in and the classes I took because I was always looking for professors and people who would push me, I guess, in that way and help develop that like critical mindset, I guess. Um, and I think it also pushed me to not participate as much in like Penn activities, but like go out into Philly and like actually be a part of that community. And that is not something I would say that like the typical Penn student engages in. Like I know so many people who have like just stayed in West Philly and like maybe went to Center City and that's it. It's like amazing. And so I really like pushed myself to do different jobs and like just join like the Philly running club and like different stuff that really helped me. I felt like kind of put down roots, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think it's kind of yes and like it's a little bit of both, which I'm not sure is like a super helpful answer, but I think that was just a part of my experience. Because I think in reality, you're like, of like, I don't even remember exactly what the number is, but I think it's something like of the 32 Rhodes Scholars, like 26 or something came from Ivy League. So like obviously that is like there's a disparity there. Like people do, as messed up as it is, like put a lot of weight to Ivy Leagues, to other high caliber schools. And so I think to not acknowledge that is just a dishonesty and like disservice to navigating how you move through the world. So I think that's just a reality. And there, the things that you do and the spaces you put yourself also impact, I think, your experience and then how you continue to move forward.
Well, Mackenzie, I think you just got at the heart of the book here, sir, because that's what we're talking about. It's a yes and statement. That's why we said, in a perfect world, I could change it, and there wouldn't be any inequality. It would just be great for everyone. But unfortunately, I can't do that. So we try to write this book to help folks out to do the best they can with what they have. And I guess the point behind that statement of it's not the brand name, but the brand behind your name is yes. Obviously, if you have that, it's an insignia, it's an emblem. It does denote a certain class or caliber, and that can open door spaces that you might normally get to. But in order for you to have gotten to University of Penn, you need to have been great yourself. The brand behind your name had to have been great just to get to that point. So I guess what we're trying to do is help them get to what you've done, to get where you've gone, to be able to have that brand name and be comfortable with the brand behind their own name, whether it be the social identity or socioeconomic status, if they can kind of own that story and learn who they are and use competency-based materials, they can hopefully achieve just as much as anybody else and also get to that brand name, that Ivy League.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yes, definitely.
So I appreciate the advice you have for folks. I love the chosen family, only Jen, the yes and, that's great. Definitely putting that in there. You really hit the points right on the head there.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to read your book. I can't wait. I'm sure you'll post about it on LinkedIn, hopefully, and I'll like see it and everything.
Of course, of course. There's one or two more questions here for you if you have time for that.
Yeah, sure.
So you have an extensive experience in policy, I believe, both as an intern and as a fellow. What is the relationship between educational policy and the reform that you might hope to see?
The reform specific to educational policy?
Yes.
Everything. I think you mentioned that earlier. Like we just need to change everything. I mean, using Philadelphia as an example, it's one of the most inequitably funded education systems in the States. There's a lot of them. It's, there's a lot of inequitably funded public education. And that was like the first internship that I had was at an organization called Public Citizens for Children and Youth, or PCCY. And their main sort of topic is educational equity and like how we achieve that. And recently there was the fair funding bill that was passed, I think like 5 years ago now, that does now say like all the funds from just Philadelphia, it's not the surrounding counties, like go into one pot and then they have to be distributed equally. But all of the previous funds that were there before that are still distributed by tax incomes depending on the house. So obviously then, which is the case in a lot of places in the country, if you're living in a wealthy neighborhood, then that school is better funded, et cetera, et cetera. If you're living in a poor neighborhood, then that school is under-resourced. I'm sure I don't need to tell you any of this. So I think that's one of the primary things we do need to change is like schools in public schools should not be funded based on the tax, like the home tax income, anything like that. I think every place there needs to be a central pot and it needs to be evenly distributed, period. It should not be tied to like any kind of wealth tax or home revenue tax, property taxes, like that just needs to be canceled. And because I think that's such a huge problem of like, particularly in St. Louis, like the vast majority of anyone who can tries to go to private school because like all of the public schools are so underfunded. And even though like there's a few good ones that are pretty much like far out in West County, which is supposed to be like, it's like pretty much the wealthiest part of St. Louis County. So those private schools, I mean, those public schools are like pretty solid, but then anywhere else for the most part are really underfunded and under-resourced. And I think that then, of course, like when we're looking at charter schools, I'm very against charter schools because it's diverting funding from public schools. And then there's a lack of oversight in terms of what they're doing. And if we just look at the statistics of like when youth go to charter schools, then a lot of times they don't actually have access to the resources they have. So I think the answer is more like we need to fund the public schools and not say, okay, we're going to put them in like a half private school, half public school. It's like, what if we just funded the public? Like, what are we doing? Yeah, like I don't understand. And especially right now in Philadelphia, we're seeing this mass migration from the school district of Philadelphia to cyber charters, because then the kids are like still, in school. I live across the street from this like ridiculously expensive private school, and they've had in-person classes. They're still having in-person classes, and it's just like wild. And I think right now with the state of the pandemic, we're just seeing like, hopefully, I think anyone who's been like awake has seen the funding disparities and educational disparities, but now like the cracks are just like blowing, like everyone is seeing them. The roof is being blown off of any sort of like masking of those. But I think if I had to say like one thing is that schools should not be funded based on property taxes.
Yeah, you make a good point. You're definitely well versed in your craft, and I can tell that you're passionate about it. It's definitely something that needs changed, but just being aware of that and raising the issue, even in a book like this, I'm hoping it just kind of gets the word out, right? Lets people know that this is happening and be aware of this. This might be a trend coming up. We talk a lot about the enrollment cliff coming for admissions and how COVID has kind of hastened that. And there's just numerous things that it all ties together with higher education. And then, okay, we answered that question as well. That's good. I have one more personal question for you. As someone who was first gen, lower socioeconomic status, transracial adoptee, I fit into some categories, not all obviously, and I'm hoping to get my PhD or EDD. I'm right now pursuing my Master of Education at Penn State, and I love it here, don't get me wrong. And I was looking at a doctorate for University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Do you know what they might be looking for in the admissions process to get to an Ivy League like University of Penn? Like, what can I do to better my chances?
I think you're already doing, like, you're writing a book. Like, I'm fully serious. Like, they would be ridiculously stupid not to take you. And I think it's also just like, again, like you said, you have had a lot of experiences. I think it sounds like that informed the work you want to do, and you're so passionate and like well-versed. And I think there is the population of people who like have taught specifically and then go into these things. And then it's not like they're divided, but I think that's just a part of the people who go get their doctorates in education. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because I've heard some people be like, well, I have to have like been a teacher in like a rundown public school for like a decade. And it's like, no, you don't. And then like right now, like, because that's part of why I was like, I'm getting my PhD right now because the policy changes cannot wait. Like they cannot wait. We have to get in there like right now. And obviously, like, I don't know what you want to do long term, but genuinely, I think you're already doing it. Like you're getting a master's in like, which a lot of people also haven't necessarily finished. And you're writing a book. Like I can't even. And it sounds like you're just really doing, like, you already are thinking about it so critically and holistically. And I think that's something they really look for too, is like looking at the nuance of identities and disparities. And, you know, we're living in 2020, again, like disparity, I think, is being blown up. Trump almost just got reelected. Like 1 million, like unarmed Black people have continued to be killed by police. Like all these things are happening. And I think, unfortunately, social justice was like, you know, it's kind of the last thing that high caliber universities are thinking about. And now it's like a glaring spotlight. And I think that's, you know, all of the things you're doing and like literally the topic of your book just demonstrates that that's already something that you live your life doing.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mackenzie. I really do. I didn't want you to think that I was just looking to get to University of Penn just for the Ivy League status. It was more because I'm a Central PA, born and raised here. I went to Shikellamy High School, which is middle of nowhere, and then right across the street was Square University. So I went there for undergrad, and now I'm at Penn State, big Penn State, for grad
Right.
school. And I'm like, you know what? I really enjoy being here in Pennsylvania. I'd love to stay here if I can, instead of running off different things. Because why would I go there? There's so many populations right here. We're kind of a boom right now of minoritized populations in Central PA. They're having a harder time adapting. I figure if I can stay here, why not make the place that I grew up and gave me so much give back when there's already so much to be done in this state? And so I kind of like, oh, if I can stay in PA and still get my doctorate, that would be the goal. So that was my reasoning behind that question then, just to give you some insight.
That's awesome. Well, I'm sending you so many good vibes. I can't wait to read your book. And you really are just doing such important work, incredible work.
Thank you. Thank you again. As we're wrapping up here, are there any last minute questions that you have for me, or things I didn't answer, or things you wanted to talk about that I just didn't get to?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
That is great. That is great. So I will obviously get back to you about what parts go in the book. If you're comfortable with that, you can see
Yeah,
before I edit that. That way, it's all good on your end. I don't want to put something up there that's not true or is not something you would say or anything like that.
thank you. That's super thoughtful of you.
Of course, of course. Is there anything else before we wrap up here today?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Thank you again for being with me. I really do appreciate that. I will get back to you soon with your part in the book all written down, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. It was awesome talking
You
with you,
too. Yeah,
Mackenzie.
you too. Take care.
Bye now. How do you do it so fast?